say, well, you can't have a poll tax. They can say you can't have a gas tax or a cigarette tax or anything else. And federal government's telling the states pretty tough what their business is. Now, you can say that they can't discriminate, but I've got to prove that it discriminates, and I can't prove it in Texas. There are more niggers voting there now than white folks. There are more of them buying poll taxes now than white folks. Higher percentage of them. And I can't show that the literacy test that discriminate against, because they haven't got any. They got no test at all. Just by God, anybody that can get up and pay $1.06 can vote.
I find this particularly interesting that LBJ says we can understand this without rancor or hatred. You know, it's a lot easier for a white guy to say that than a black guy. But this is what he said, that we're going to set hatred behind us. And we're going to acknowledge our history, and we're going to acknowledge the nature of humankind. Well, here he is.
The reasons are deeply embedded in history and tradition and the nature of man. We can understand without rancor or hatred how this all happened. But it cannot continue. Our Constitution, the foundation of our republic, forbids it. The principles of our freedom forbid it. Morality forbids it. And the law I will sign tonight forbids it.
And thus kicked off, you know, an era of, well, a decade certainly, of incredible violence in the South. George Washington, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever.
Let us rise to the call of freedom-loving blood that is in us, and send our answer to the tyranny that clanks its chains upon the South. In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
George Wallace standing at the university doors. I mean, it's just, it is, thus began this process.
When the TV started bringing some of that evil spirit that was out there into the homes, people actually, though, had different reactions. Some of them were actually ashamed of what was going on, and they wanted to get in and try to help bring about change. But there were other people who sort of dug in their heels.
People like Alabama Governor George Wallace, who blocked the integration of the state university by literally standing in the door.
I stand here today as governor of this sovereign state and refuse to wittingly submit to illegal usurpation of power by the central government.
President Kennedy was forced to federalize National Guard troops to remove Wallace. Civil rights leaders were pleased to see the president finally use the bully pulpit for their cause.
But they have a right to expect that the law will be fair, that the Constitution...
On June 12th, the Wallace-Kennedy confrontation was front-page news.
It's a really interesting thing. In 1964, the major party of the racists in the United States in the South was the Democratic Party. And in parts of the North, George Wallace took Michigan in the 68 presidential primary. Now, he took it because Michigan had open primaries and Republicans were voting in the primary to make the Democrats look bad. But still, Michigan sent George Wallace as its delegate to the Democratic National Convention. But immediately, Nixon latched onto this and said, LBJ's given up the Southern white racists. We'll take them.
Not enough troops in the army to force the Southern people to break down segregation and admit the Negro race into our theaters, into our swimming pools, into our homes, and into our...
Pretty pretty sure you can call that guy a racist and a huge dick. Talking John Ham-sized dick. And a Southern Democrat at the time. Until 1964 when he switched to the Republican Party. Why? Racism. And he wasn't the only one. When Democratic President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, Northern Democrats were expected to embrace notions of equality at rates that made Southern Democrats as uncomfortable as a young Donald Trump at a quinceañera. After signing the Civil Rights Act, Johnson famously said, "We just delivered the South to the Republican Party for a long time to come." He knew that civil rights would be politicized and that the South would turn Republican. He was right. After a meeting of the Republican National Committee in the summer of 1963, conservative journalist Robert Novak said, "A good many, perhaps a majority of the party's leadership envisioned substantial political gold to be mined in the racial crisis by becoming, in fact, though not in name, the white man's party." Around this time, Strom Thurmond strongly supported Barry Goldwater when the Republican senator from Arizona ran against Johnson in '64. Now, this might seem surprising since Goldwater had voted in favor of civil rights in '57 and '60. But when he ran for president, he hoped everyone had forgotten that. He's even quoted as saying, "We're not going to get the Negro vote as a bloc, so we ought to go hunting where the ducks are." The ducks being white Southerners, who eventually became a Duck Dynasty. Johnson won the '64 election, and then with the passage of the '65 Voting Rights Act, which made it a lot easier for people to vote, mostly black people, Southerners were pissed! Like angrier than if Carrie Underwood became hip-hop. And thus, the Southern strategy was born. Because if you can't use racism to stop people from voting, you can use people's racism to vote for you. The Southern strategy became such a tentpole for the GOP that in 2005, Republican National Committee Chairman Ken Mehlman formally apologized to the NAACP for exploiting racial polarization to win elections and ignoring the black vote, which means they're totally sorry and they're not going to do it again.
Texas voter ID law is discriminatory. That ruling today from the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals.
It's kind of like Chipotle guaranteeing that no one will ever get E. coli from their burritos, and then everyone getting E. coli from their burritos. I mean, I guess we shouldn't be surprised, especially after you hear this clip straight from Lee Atwater, one of the most famous GOP operatives and an advisor to Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Listen to what he admits to.
You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts your backfire, so you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. Because obviously sitting around saying we want to cut taxes, we want to cut this, and we want is much more abstract than even the busing thing. And a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger nigger.
What the fuck? Take note that he acknowledges that since overt racism was no longer possible, using abstract language like states' rights or cutting taxes becomes code for marginalizing black people. It's the playbook that GOP candidates would follow up to and including today. The Southern strategy has evolved, though, from shoring up votes from racist white Americans to getting religious nuts all up in arms over gay marriage and abortion. Instead of states' rights in regard to segregation and voting rights, it's now religious liberties. Don't be fooled. It's the same strategy, whipping the same susceptible group into a frenzy over nothing. It's like when Apple makes a big announcement about the new iPhone SE, but we all know it's just an iPhone 5 with a better camera. Just saying. So again, were the individual politicians racist? Well, yeah, some of them probably were. But those who weren't were happy to take advantage of the racism that did exist. Which brings us to everyone's favorite play-by-the-rules, always a good guy, totally into equality president, Republican Richard Nixon. As we know, Nixon won the 68 and 72 elections. How? In part due to the Southern strategy. For instance, Strom Thurmond, this guy again, supported Nixon in the 68 election, helping him secure parts of the South. And a White House memo from 1971, perhaps the only thing he didn't record while in office, but just as bad, dictates how Nixon could exploit the South. Exploit it he did. Worse than Hugh Hefner exploiting daddy issues. Apparently helping black children integrate and go to school was bad news bears.
I am opposed to busing for the purpose of achieving racial balance in our schools. I have spoken out against busing scores of times over many years. And I believe most Americans, white and black, share that view.
Obviously, this guy really had his finger on the pulse of America, especially black America. Nixon's opposition to busing was a loophole that would prevent integration of schools. It was his version of the "I got you, bro" to the South, and the South responded with the political version of an awkward white fist bump. votes. If you need one more reason to think Nixon was a good guy, John Ehrlichman, his former policy advisor, said this: the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Speaking of just say no, next up is the GOP's modern-day Jesus, Ronald Reagan. Ronnie campaigned a lot on the economy and helped popularize the term welfare queen. While certainly derogatory towards women, it was also a veiled put-down toward people of color. This is some of that coded language or dog whistle politics the GOP played. For example, by 1973, in magazine pictures depicting welfare recipients, 75% featured African Americans, even though African Americans made up only 35% of welfare recipients. The media was helping skew the outlook of the public, and politicians were happy to oblige. Because when you've trained an audience to believe certain things to be true for over 20 years, you no longer need to run a campaign on it. It becomes a foregone conclusion. So when Ronald Reagan campaigned on the economy and national defense, like Lee Atwater said, you didn't need to mention race. Given his previous support of Goldwater and Nixon, Southerners could feel confident that Reagan was the Bert to their Ernie. In a non-gay way, of course. Whether Reagan was or wasn't racist himself, who knows? But he took advantage of the racial divide that existed, standing on the shoulder of giants. Racist giants. But who was behind so many of these men, from Nixon to the GOP today? Basically, Voldemort, aka Roger Ailes, head of Fox News. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. This bovine beauty has been the secret weapon of the GOP since Nixon. At his core, he is one of the most brilliant television producers whose success at manipulating the public remained unmatched. Until Donald Trump's takeover of the media.
You're going to find out about the media someday, folks. They are the worst.
But what's the story here? In 1960, when Nixon looked like this, and Kennedy looked like this, Nixon lost. In fairness, that's like watching a supermodel go up against a gremlin for the cover of Sports Illustrated. No one wants to see that. Nixon needed to learn to be camera ready as he started to embark on his Southern strategy in '68, and Ailes, a TV producer, was the one to help him. But what's telling is that the man who got Ailes into politics and would prove to be one of the most paranoid and dirty campaigners in history fired Ailes because he was not among the first-rate men that we could have in this field. When Nixon thinks you're shady, you might have a problem. That's like Kim Kardashian DMing you on Twitter and saying, hey, maybe you should put some clothes on. Richard Nixon, the man who had to resign the presidency of the United States, who cheated and lied to stay in power, thought Ailes was not a good guy.
But immediately, Nixon latched onto this and said, LBJ's given up the Southern white racists, we'll take them.
Public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
In January of 1973, the Supreme Court legalized abortion on demand throughout the United States, and almost immediately, the Religious Coalition for Abortion Rights was formed.
Less than a year earlier, the following conversation had taken place in the Oval Office of the White House. It began on the 30th of March, 1972, and continued 4 days later on the 3rd of April. This is an actual recording of that conversation. The speakers are the President of the United States, Republican Richard Nixon, and members of his senior staff.
A majority of people in Colorado voted for abortion. I think a majority of people in Michigan are voting for abortion. I think in both cases, well, certainly in Michigan they will vote for it because they think what's going to be aborted generally are the little black bastards. As I told you, we talked about it earlier, that a hell of a lot of people want to control the Negro bastard down. Isn't that very true? So we know what we're talking about, population control. Sure. We're talking really in what John Rockefeller realizes. The people in what we call our class control their populations. Sometimes they'll have a family of 6 or 7 or 8 or 9. But it's exception. The people who don't control their families are people in The people that shouldn't have kids. Now that's the black population. Black in the city of San Francisco has gone from 3,000 right after World War II to where they represent 30% of the population of San Francisco. Yes, sir.
The Religious Coalition for Abortion Rights was originally created with the financial backing of John Rockefeller, and its current president is an African American who was once appointed to the Washington, D.C. City Council by Richard Nixon. In the early 1990s, the organization changed its name and is today known as the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice.
The briefing team will now be ready to answer any questions on the technical details of the program.
Nixon proclaiming this war on drugs is this epic moment. Nixon standing up as the law and order president.
But behind the scenes, there's another agenda at work.
In the eyes of the inner circle of the Nixon administration, the war on drugs brought together the peace movement, the hippies, the counterculture, African Americans. All of this stuff can be captured and addressed by force with law enforcement under the rubric of the war on drugs. And the trick is to create a system that deals with this without appearing to.
This announcement this morning is the culmination of a project that began about a year ago.
It'll be decades before one of Nixon's top advisors will allegedly admit to a magazine writer this deception behind the origin of the war on drugs.
The Nixon campaign had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
Dirty tricks was what Richard Nixon was all about, including Watergate, in that first term of his, and then in the second term, as far as it lasted. Part of that goes back to the 1960 campaign between Nixon and Kennedy and his father employed all these dirty tricks to in essence, steal the election from Nixon. So Nixon vowed that he was going to use anything under the sun to get into power and to maintain power in his leadership position.
Robinson and Nixon met in 1952 at the Republican National Convention. From the mid-1950s on, they began correspondence that lasted through 1972. Robinson was attracted to Nixon for a couple reasons.
I know what it means to be poor. I know what it means to see people who are unemployed.
Robinson ate that up.
But he realized shortly after, when Dr. King was jailed and he went to Nixon and he said, you know, you've got to go meet with him in the prison, you've got to talk to him, you need to support this man. And Nixon didn't follow his advice. So my father realized that Nixon didn't want him for his real, input in, particularly when it was relating to African Americans.
In 1964, the major party of the racists in the United States in the South was the Democratic Party. And in parts of the North, George Wallace took Michigan in the 68 presidential primary. Now, he took it because Michigan had open primaries and Republicans were voting in the primary to make the Democrats look bad. But still, Michigan sent George Wallace as its delegate to the Democratic National Convention. But immediately, Nixon latched onto this and said, LBJ's given up the Southern white racists, we'll take them.
What happened is that John F. Kennedy called Coretta, expressed his concern. Robert F. Kennedy called the local judge to help secure King's release. And Martin Luther King Sr. comes out following those actions and says, John F. Kennedy has my vote. And the African American vote swung to Kennedy, and he won the election. And many political analysts believe that that was one of the key moments where Nixon really lost the race.
And when I say Kennedy, I mean John F. Kennedy. The man who promised all the American so-called Negroes who vote what he was going to do for them when he got in office, and has yet to do the first thing that he promised, but has paid off the Negro leadership so that they are silent and say nothing about the promises that he originally made to get Negroes to vote for him. Now, and I think that he is way out of line to use his position now as the first Catholic president to open up his mouth against a religious group. If he's not going to open up his mouth and outright condemn the Citizens Council by name, and condemn this Ku Klux Klan by name, and condemn the white Masonic order, which is all white, by name, and the white churches in the South by name, then Kennedy is wrong. To point at the Muslims, because we are black, they call us a hate group, and Martin Luther King is running around here telling Negroes to love all kind of white people, and they sick dogs on Martin Luther King. So it answers itself, and it shows the hypocrisy of the white man.
It was the official policy of the United States government until 1968. In my lifetime and the lifetime of 90 senators who serve today, the official policy of this government was to help white people buy homes and to deny that help to black people. And because the federal government had set the standard, private lenders enthusiastically followed in Washington's lead. Homes are the way that millions of working families build some economic security. They pay down a mortgage and own an asset that, over time, often appreciates. A home serves as security to fund other ventures, to start a small business, or to send a youngster to college. And if grandma and grandpa can hang on to the home and get it paid off, they can often pass along an asset that boosts the finances of the next generation and the one after that. And that's exactly what white people have done for generations, but not black people. Systematically, over many decades, government policies that encouraged mortgage companies to lend only to white borrowers cut the legs out from underneath minority families trying to build some family wealth. And the result has been exactly what you'd predict. It's contributed to a staggering gap of wealth between white communities and communities of color today. Here's one statistic from Massachusetts. According to the Boston Globe, the median net worth of white families living in Boston is $247,500. And the median net worth for a black family is $8. That's something that all Americans, regardless of race, should be ashamed of. When I was traveling around the country in the aftermath of the financial crisis, it became clear to me that the crash had made the problem worse. Subprime lenders who had peddled mortgages full of tricks and traps had specifically targeted minority borrowers. That meant that during the Great Recession, a huge number of minority borrowers lost their homes. And when rising home prices helped white Americans regain some financial security, communities of color, with their lower homeownership rates and their higher foreclosure rates, were often left behind. Again, just one example. According to Pew, between 2010 and 2013, the median wealth of white households grew by 2.4%, but the wealth of Hispanic households in that same time fell by 14.3%, and the wealth of African American households fell by 33.7%. Mortgage discrimination didn't end in the 1960s when formal redlining policies were abolished. It didn't end with the tightening of mortgage rules following the financial crisis. Lending discrimination is still alive and well in America in 2018. According to a new report that just came out from the Center for Investigative Reporting and Reveal, in 2015 and 2016, nearly 2/3 of mortgage lenders denied loans for people of color at higher rates than for white people. This problem affects both big lenders and small lenders, and it's nationwide. Minority borrowers were more likely to be denied a mortgage than white borrowers with the same income in 61 different cities across America. And how do we know that? Because of HMDA data. That's how we can see how much black families were charged for a mortgage, or how often Latino families were denied a chance to take out a mortgage. And we can compare those numbers with white borrowers who have the same incomes and same credit scores. But we can't do that if the data are missing. It is impossible to detect and fight mortgage discrimination without HMDA data. The bill on the floor of the Senate says that 85% of banks will no longer be required to report HMDA data, including the borrower's credit score and age, the loan's points, fees, and interest rate, and the property value. 85%. These data are essential to figuring out whether the borrower got a fair deal or not. If this bill passes, there will be entire communities where there won't be enough data to figure out whether borrowers are getting ripped off. Entire communities where it will be impossible to monitor whether people are getting cheated because of their race or gender. Entire communities where federal and state regulators won't be able to bring cases, and independent groups like Reveal won't be able to hold these groups accountable. Sure, banks will save a little money by not having to fill out the HMDA data. But when communities of color are once again left behind, there will be no way to prove it. And that's why civil rights groups around the country have spoken up against this bill. The Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights said, and I'm quoting, "Exempting the overwhelming majority of our nation's banks and credit unions from an expanded HMDA requirement that would better enable federal regulators, state attorneys general, fair housing advocates, and others to identify and address discriminatory and predatory mortgage practices is unwise." The Urban League and the National Community Reinvestment Coalition wrote in a newspaper column that the bill, quote, would be a giant step backwards for the public and national groups who use this data to ensure that banks treat all borrowers equally. And according to the NAACP, the bill, quote, would devastate our attempts to determine and potentially rectify racially discriminatory lending or loan approval patterns at play. This is about basic fairness. HMDA data is an investment we should be making to make sure that all qualified Americans have the same chance to buy a home. Throughout our history, Washington has always fallen short of that goal. Gutting HMDA allows our country and our government to ignore discrimination, letting history repeat itself. Communities of color will pay the price if this Congress makes the same mistakes again. It isn't too late. We can stop this bill from becoming law.
Philip, tell me about Dream Defenders.
Dream Defenders came out of the realization, as the senator said, and other people in this audience know, that the people that are murdering the people in our communities are very organized. And so if you're going to mount ample resistance to those forces, then you must be organized. And so we started Dream Defenders with that in mind, knowing that it wasn't just about Trayvon Martin, but it's about a system of police repression, police harassment, racial profiling. We've got a school-to-prison pipeline. We've got a war on drugs that's been afflicting, dividing, and killing our communities since it started. We've got a war on the poor. We've got a war on immigrant communities. And if you're going to mount a fight against a system that has for 400 years perfected the method of repression of people that look like me, look like us, then you've got to have an organized force to fight against that. So we started in Florida with that in mind.
Do you see what Senator McCaskill talks about, the elective office as one way? Because you just bit off a lot. A lot.
Well, I think we the people to do it. I'm hungry. And I think running for office is good. But one of the last things that Dr. King said before he died was that he feared that he had brought us into a burning building. And so if you're getting people elected into a system that by its very nature was meant to cannibalize and kill communities, then you've only done half of the job. And so I think it's a yes and. We need people that look like us, but black officers. I've had interactions with black officers that were way worse than white officers. And so it's not a matter of just having a representative that's on the city council or in the mayor's office or in the police force that looks like you. They've got to come from the community, know the issues of the community, and then there's folks in the community that got to remind them every day that we pay your bills. And we're watching every single day to ensure that the platform on which we elected you with is followed, and also defend you when those people that seek to calibrate the system and write the system as it's been built seek to come at you for that office.
Now here's the thing, Philip. Everybody doesn't agree with you. Everybody doesn't see the root of the problem. Ross Kaminsky is one of them. Ross Kaminsky writes for American Spectator, and he thinks, in fact, that a lot of folks should be looking at themselves in the mirror.
I want to be really clear on this because I agree with what the mayor of Ferguson said, that, middle-class white guys like me haven't lived the African-American life. That said, from what we see on the news, from what we read, there seems to be a real dearth of leadership among African-American young men, especially in their neighborhoods. And the other thing is, if I could react to what Philip said, I get the feeling, I understand this feeling of this system isn't fair. It's biased against us. But then when you start going to this idea, 400 years of repression in a system that's still designed to hurt us and still designed to keep us down, that starts feeling to me like racism against me just because of the color of my skin. My parents weren't here 400 years ago. My family arrived here way after the Civil War. We had nothing to do with it. And I think that a lot of people in the rest of America feel like we're being blamed for things that we didn't cause, and in fact that we would like to help because we should care.
For everybody who's laughing and snickering, no, let me make a point to you. St. Louis, there was a St. Louis County poll done just last week, in which roughly 60% of the people said, I think that this is a problem. And those 60% of the people were black. And then 60% of white people said, I don't think it's a problem. There is a real, true divide. And a lot of people who agree with what Ross Kaminsky said. So I want this conversation to take that into account as well, even if you disagree.
When can I just say,
Sure.
I'm not saying that I don't think there's a problem. I think there's a huge problem, and I think that middle-class white people who don't live near black neighborhoods should understand that it's a problem for them too. What I'm saying is that the language, when it starts being turned in a way that even just implies you're the problem because you're white, it ends the conversation and removes any chance of positive conversation.
Is that what you're saying, Phil?
No, absolutely not. So I never mentioned black, white, or people. I mentioned systems. And so the arrest of Darren Wilson, if it happens, and the conviction of Darren Wilson, if it happens, though the system and the history would tell us that it may not, will not alleviate the problems that are happening here and that are happening around the country. For example, I can sit here with a great amount of empathy and say every day George Zimmerman woke up and saw that black men were evil. Every single day since he was a little kid, he woke up and saw on television, on cops, on the news, on his TV shows and videos that black men were filled with malice and had criminal intent in every movement that they made. And so with the great amount of empathy, I could say that he may not be to blame for a very subliminal reaction to what he did when he saw a black man in a hoodie, right? I'm not mad so much at George Zimmerman. I'm mad at a system every day that stakes its claim on saying that there's a certain segment of society that is a criminal element.
Why do you feel it's important for you as an officer to be standing out here and representing this point of view?
Two things. Number one, I want to give the residents of Ferguson the knowledge that there are some police that do support them. The second thing is I want to try to get a message to mainstream America that this system is corrupt. The police really are oppressing not only the black community, but also the whites. It's an oppressive organization now controlled by the 1%, corporate America. Corporate America is using police forces as their mercenaries.
The fourth challenge is to take back our streets from crime, gangs, and drugs. And we have actually been making progress on this count as a nation because of what local law enforcement officials are doing, because of what citizens and neighborhood patrols are doing. We're making some progress. Much of it is related to the initiative called community policing, because we have finally gotten more police officers on the street. That was one of the goals that the president had when he pushed the crime bill that was passed in 1994. He promised 100,000 police. We're moving in that direction, but we can see it already makes a difference. Because if we have more police interacting with people, having them on the streets, we can prevent crimes. We can prevent petty crimes from turning into something worse. But we also have to have an organized effort against gangs. Just as in a previous generation we had an organized effort against the mob. We need to take these people on. They are often connected to big drug cartels. They are not just gangs of kids anymore. They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy. We can talk about why they ended up that way, but first we have to bring them to heel. And the president has asked the FBI to launch a very concerted effort against gangs everywhere. In addition to that, he has appointed a new drug czar. You probably saw him Tuesday night. He's one of the most distinguished active military generals that we have in our country. He's already proven that he knows how to interdict drugs because of his command of the South American activity on behalf of the United States. But General McCaffrey will make a big difference, and I believe it is now time for all of us to know what we can do individually to be part of this anti-crime, anti-gangs, anti-drug effort.
Very straightforward and simple. He knows there are two basic steps here. One step is you must take back the streets. And you take back the streets by more cops, more prisons, more physical protection for the people. He also understands what my friend from Texas understands, and he doesn't talk a lot about, but he signed on to in this bill. He also understands there's a need to keep people who are first-time offenders, who are nonviolent offenders, or who are potential first-time offenders who haven't gotten, I yield myself an additional 3 minutes, who in fact are people who are getting themselves into the crime stream for the first time, that they should be diverted from the system. So I hope this crime bill, when it passes, the Biden-Hatch crime bill, as it becomes law, God willing, I hope that we will have ended once and for all this notion that is a hangover from the 60s, that somehow Democrats are weak on crime and Democratic presidents are weak on crime and Republicans are tough on crime. The truth is, every major crime bill since 1976 that's come out of this Congress, every minor crime bill has had the name of the Democratic senator from the state of Delaware, Joe Biden, on that bill, and has had a majority vote of the Democratic members of the United States Senate on the bill. The consensus is A, we must take back the streets. It doesn't matter whether or not the person that is accosting your son or daughter or my son or daughter, my wife, your husband, my mother, your parents. It doesn't matter whether or not they were deprived as a youth. It doesn't matter whether or not they had no background that enabled them to become socialized into the fabric of society. It doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society. The end result is they're about to knock my mother on the head with a lead pipe, shoot my sister, beat up my wife, take on my sons. So I don't want to ask what made them do this. They must be taken off the street. That's number one. There's a consensus on that. The Democratic chairman of the Judiciary Committee, the Democratic president of the United States of America, the Democratic attorney general, the Republican leader of this effort, Senator Hatch, the Republican senator from Texas. We all agree on that. There's a second thing that we all have agreed upon, and that is unless we do something about that cadre of young people, tens of thousands of them, born out of wedlock, without parents, without supervision, without any structure, without any conscience developing, because they literally, I yield myself 3 more minutes, because they literally have not been socialized. They literally have not had an opportunity. We should focus on them now, not out of a liberal instinct for love, brother, and humanity, although I think that's a good instinct, but for simple, pragmatic reasons. If we don't, they will, or a portion of them will, become the predators 15 years from now. And Madam President, we have predators on our streets that society has, in fact, in part because of its neglect, created. Again, it does not mean because we created them that we somehow forgive them or do not take them out of society to protect my family and yours from them. They are beyond the pale, many of those people. Beyond the pale. And it's a sad commentary on society. We have no choice but to take them out of society.
When this bill is law, we will have 100,000 police officers on the street, a 20% increase. It will be used to build prisons to keep 100,000 violent criminals off the street. We will have the means by which we can say punishment will be more certain.
The whippings of mass distraction have always been in the play. People follow their sports teams more than they follow the things that's going to affect them every day. So a lot of times the bills are passed and politicians go back and forth, and all of a sudden you turn around and there's a crime bill that not only affects your present, but really seriously affects your future.
Clinton passed a crime bill which allowed now 14-year-olds to be tried as adults, more prisons being built.
The impact of the crime bill is devastating and felt almost immediately. For example, the 3 strikes law. This idea that if you have 3 offenses, that you're out of here, right? Like you go away. It increases your sentencing dramatically. That is embedded into the crime bill.
Violent crimes should be told. When you commit a 3rd violent crime, you will be put away and put away for good.
Nothing at all, boss. Nothing at all.
Sentencing discrepancies when it comes to drugs.
Cocaine versus crack.
Crack. Cocaine.
Cocaine versus crack cocaine.
The penalty for possession of 5 grams of crack cocaine, the drug used and sold by many young blacks, is 5 years in prison. The penalty for possession of 5 grams of powdered cocaine, the drug favored by the white middle class, is probation.
And that's why so many people who got caught with very small amounts ended up doing really major time.
Do you think you'll be coming back here again?
That's hard to say.
These communities were asking for help. We know that they were like, we have problems. But what they were asking for was to get to the root of the problem. So that doesn't mean locking up a generation of African Americans or labeling every black man who walks out of his house a gangbanger.
We stand at the crossroads of controversy, peering into the heart of a claim so incendiary it threatens to ignite the very fabric of political legacy. At the center of this controversy is the 36th President of the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson, a man ensnared by a single contentious statement that is echoed through time. I will have those niggers voting Democrat for the next 200 years. This assertion, as viral as it is disputed, has leaped across the digital landscape, brandished like a weapon in the war of ideologies. It paints a picture of Machiavellian political maneuvering, hidden in the guise of civil rights advocacy. But does this shadow cast upon Johnson's legacy hold any weight? Today we unravel this thread, seeking the golden needle of truth in a haystack of historical assumptions. Within the hallowed halls of credible scholarship and the sanctums of historical records, this claim evades validation. It is a specter without a source, an echo without an origin in Johnson's public speeches or private correspondence. Like a phantom, it eludes capture by the reliable nets of evidence. It is an undeniable truth that Johnson's language in the shadows of privacy bore the scars of his time, a dialect marked by racial epithets. However, this uncomfortable reality offers no sanctuary to the specific allegations at hand. Human complexity mandates a chasm between the private utterances and the public actions of a man whose policies painted a different portrait. Johnson's utterances danced a delicate line, sometimes donning the cloak of bigotry to maneuver through the mazes of political resistance. Picture Johnson, a chameleon of dialects, tailoring his tongue to the ears of segregationists, his words a calculated performance aimed at the chessboard of civil rights legislation. Not all shadows cast by Johnson can be dismissed as mere strategic play. His interactions at times reveal a raw, undiluted prejudice that stains the pages of history, a reminder of the man's all-too-human flaws. The controversial quote first reared its head in the pages of Ronald Kessler's Exposé, an uncorroborated whisper from the past, alleging that Johnson's true motives were not a crusade for equality but a gambit for political dominion. Despite the murky waters surrounding his alleged comments, the light of historical evidence illuminates Johnson's vigorous crusade for African American civil rights, actions that perhaps speak louder than the disputed words of a conversation long past. In the annals of history, the true legacy of Lyndon B. Johnson stands as a testament to African American civil rights. His civil rights laws, a beacon that pierced the darkness of segregation and inequality. In conclusion, the murky quote attributed to Johnson remains an enigma, a specter amidst the landscape of his achievements. As the custodians of history, we grapple with the duality of a man whose legacy is a patchwork of shadows and light, leaving us to ponder the impenetrable depths of a president's heart.
I just talked with Steve White. He mentioned to me about your what you think about doing today, and the two people are the judgeship concerned.
Yeah.
And I think that's excellent. I think both of them are good men.
I want to do it if your people want me to do it. I don't want to do it just because they serve them up and got no one else, because I've got 40 men that would like to have a judge. But if these are the best ones in the community, and we can give them some recognition, and our people will understand it, and you all can do something about it, let them know that I'm not a hater and a bigot. You know that, but a lot of them don't. They keep saying I have all this trouble in the Negro community, and I've never heard a Negro say that.
Well, I haven't either. I don't.
But I keep reading in the columnists where They don't quote you, and they don't quote Roy Wilkins, and they don't quote Farmer, and they don't quote Martin Luther King, and they don't quote Phil Randolph, because every damn one of them knows that I'm stronger for them than nearly anybody around this place, and have been all these years. Well, I do want to get concerned, because I want them to know that I'm their friend.
Well, you make moves like you think to do today. You don't have any question on this.
Well, but I'm afraid they just think, well, that's because that somebody recommended him is with Kennedy.
No, this won't happen.
All right, now if you want it, it'll be done.
I won't.
Now, the president wanted it, and he would have done it. And I feel like I've got an obligation to it, but I don't want to do it unless the whole Negro community knows that I'm done it and the Democrats have done it, and with this damn jet and the rest of them quit cutting us up saying we hate the niggers.
Yeah, well, no, you won't have that to worry about. This is what we want.
All right, it'll be done.
All right.
Thank you.